Good morning, Kinaway members, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Kinaway TV. As always, before we kick things off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm coming to you all from. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which each and every one of us are tuning in from, and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd like to also extend those respects to any Indigenous people who are joining us for today's webinar. For this morning's webinar, we're pleased to be joined by Rob Hayes. Rob is Director of ID Onboarding at Australian Business Registry Services and joins us today to discuss all things Director ID. It's a particularly important topic to those with which this applies, as the registration deadline is fast approaching. Rob will be making a presentation for us this morning, along with answering any questions that we may receive throughout. So without taking up too much more time, I'd like to welcome Rob into today's webinar. G'day, Rob. How you going?
Good morning, James, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. A real privilege to come and speak with you today. I'm joining you from the country of the Barrakalung people of the Kurnai Nation in regional Victoria, just outside of Traralgon. As James mentioned, my name is Rob Hayes. I'm the Director of Director ID Onboarding within the Australian Business Registry Services. The ABRS is a division managed by the Australian Taxation Office. Many of you would be familiar with the Tax Office, of course. Today's session, as James had mentioned, director identification. We are very rapidly approaching the deadline for directors to apply for their director ID, being the 30th of November 2022. Next week is the deadline for company directors. The session this morning that I'm going to present to you will provide a bit of an overview of the director ID service, how to go about applying. And we also want to provide some time to answer any questions that you might have in relation to Director ID. Thanks, James.
No worries, Rob. Thanks for joining us again this morning. I'll drop out and I'll let you continue along with the presentation.
Thanks so much. So a quick recap in relation to the creation of the Australian Business Registry Services. The ABRS is very much a part of the 2020 Budget Digital Business Plan the government announced as part of the Modernising Business Registers program. The MBR program is, or it aims to deliver new services to help businesses in streamlining the way that they register and maintain their details. Many of you may well be dealing with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission and lodging notifications through their services. And the ABRS, in the fullness of time, will be administering a new service delivered on a new registry platform. As a part of the MBR program, director identification is the first service that has been introduced through the Australian Business Registry Services. So we're going to speak a little bit about what is a director ID and why do you need it. It is important to understand the background of why director ID is being introduced. The Modernising Business Registers program will ultimately be responsible for more than 30 registers that are currently with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission and the ABR service that is managed by the Australian Taxation Office. To date, more than 1,600,000 directors have already applied for and been issued with a director identification number. And the majority, more than 86% of those directors, have successfully applied for their director ID using the online service, which I will provide a bit of an overview of shortly. I want to also talk about some of the transitional arrangements for directors of companies that are regulated by the CATSI Act and are registered with ASIC. But of course, for our First Nations people, there may be some of you who have a registration through ORIC, the Office of the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations. They look after the companies that are specifically regulated under the CATSI Act. and registered with them. There are some specific requirements for those directors, which I'll talk about a little bit in more detail shortly. I'll also provide an overview of the early benefits that we're seeing from the introduction of Director ID. Thanks, James. So about Director ID. The Director Identification Number really is being introduced to help the use or misuse, to prevent the use of false and fraudulent director identities. Today, there are very, very few validation or authentication points for those being appointed as company directors. It is possible for those who are looking to perpetrate illegal activity to register someone like Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck as a director if they choose to through current services, because there are no validations of the information that's being provided to the Australian Securities Investments Commission through company notifications. It is a company's obligation to provide true and accurate information to the regulator, but it certainly it is open to fraud and illegal activity. Director identification is expected to help prevent some of that illegal activity from happening in future. So the Director Identification Number was introduced into law quite some time ago, and the services that support Director ID were introduced in November last year. All directors are required to apply for a Director ID. The Director Identification Number itself is free to apply for. It is a number that is issued once, and each director keeps their single identification number forever for the life of their directorship and beyond. Doesn't matter whether they cease to be a director, doesn't matter whether they move interstate or overseas, the number stays with them. Thanks, James. So who needs a Director ID? Directors are the only people who are required to apply for a Director Identification Number. It is not appropriate, or it is not needed for external administrators, members of boards, public officers, secretaries, those who are not holding the office of a director. The Director Identification Number is specific and unique for directors only. The law defines those individuals as eligible officers, and an eligible officer is someone who has been appointed as a director or intends to be a director. They could be an alternate director who is acting in that capacity. Those who are intending on becoming a director can also apply for a Director ID up to 12 months ahead of their appointment as a director. I mentioned earlier, a director only needs to apply once, and there is no need for directors to appoint for more than one number, irrespective of the number of companies that they might be a director of. Thanks, James. We're often asked, how do I find out if I'm a director? One of the biggest challenges that we face is that there are many individuals in our community who may not be aware that they are actually a director of a company. Most of us might think that when we talk about directors of companies, we are talking to specifically those who are in a boardroom somewhere of large companies like banks or mining companies or other large entities. Company directors could be individuals who look after or who have been appointed to help manage large sporting organisations that are registered with ASIC. They might be directors of corporate trustees of self-managed superannuation funds. They might be individuals who have been appointed as a director of a charity or a not-for-profit organisation. The fastest way to find out if you're a director is to use the ABN lookup service. The ABN lookup service it's a register that provides the details of ABN registrations and who or the individuals or entities behind those ABN registrations. The ABN lookup provides the details of ASIC registrations, either an ACN, Australian Company Number, an ARBN, an Australian Registered Body Number, or other entities, and those directors or directors of those entities are required to apply for a director ID by the 30th of November 2022. For those entities that are registered with AURIC, those entities that are a Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander corporation, there are search facilities available through the AURIC website, auric.gov.au, for those particular entities, which will also disclose the details of directors. Those specific entities have an Indigenous Corporation Number or an ICN. Directors of those entities have a different time frame in which to apply for their director ID. Those existing directors have until the 30th of November next year, 2023, in which to apply for a director ID. For those who are directors of charities, the ACNC, acnc.gov.au, also provides a search service where you can identify who the directors of charities are. In most cases, and where those charities, again, have an Australian Company Number, an ACN, or an Australian Registered Body Number, ARBN, directors of those entities will be required to apply for their director ID. There's more information available on who needs to apply, and more importantly, when, on the ABRS website, abrs.gov.au. Thanks, James. So we've just spoken a little bit about the transitional arrangements for the different directors. Those who are directors of corporations regulated and registered with AURIC have that additional time in which to apply. Importantly, new directors, these are directors who have never been or are not currently a director of a AURIC entity. If they are being appointed from the 1st of November 2022, they need to apply for a director ID prior to their appointment. Now, I'm certainly aware that it is annual general meeting time for many AURIC registered entities, and it's usually around the time of the AGM, annual general meeting, that new directors are appointed. It's important for those new directors who may be appointed to those entities to apply for their director ID prior to their appointment. Under the Corporations Act, and for entities that are registered with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, as I mentioned, those existing directors need to apply for their director ID by the 30th of November 2022, so next week. New directors need to apply for their director identification number prior to their appointment. Thanks, James. So what are the benefits? Why do people need a director ID? So in addition to the false or fake identities that can potentially be registered today, the director identification number introduces a robust process of identity verification so that the public who are dealing with those companies and other entities can have some certainty around who stands behind these individual companies. There are some here who may be familiar with the term phoenixing. Phoenixing is when companies take deliberate steps to remove or shift their assets from one entity to another, closing down one of those entities and leaving behind debts, unpaid bills, unpaid invoices, unpaid wages, unpaid superannuation, and then commencing trading using a new entity, basically running the same type of business. It's an activity that is estimated to cost anywhere between $2 and $5 billion to the Australian economy every year. Many employees, service providers, trade suppliers, and other people miss out on payments and money that is rightfully owed to them through the activities of illegal phoenixing. And Director ID is a measure that will hopefully help prevent phoenixing from being as prevalent as it is now. So some of the other benefits that director identification will introduce is that regulators will be able to identify which companies a director is linked to and the changes that are made over time. It's important for regulators to be able to understand how many directors or the director movements between companies, and the director identification number will bring a little bit more transparency around those movements. I mentioned that director identification introduces a robust identification verification process, and we're going to talk a little bit about that shortly, about how to go about proving your identity in order to get a director ID. Currently, in the current environment, there is also the potential for the duplication of records. My full name is Robin Lawrence Hayes, but I could be known as Rob Hayes, Robin Hayes, Lawrence Hayes on any of the registers. I might be still one and the same person, but the potential for duplication exists because there is no verification or authentication of the data that is currently being provided in today's world. Director identification will certainly help prevent that from happening in future. Thanks, James. I've spoken a little bit about illegal phoenixing activity, and this is a good example of what happens to contractors and others who provide services to companies that are engaged in illegal phoenixing activity. There can be many small businesses that are impacted by this type of activity, where services are provided to a company and the invoices for those services remain unpaid as a result of that company winding down its operations and moving its assets to a new entity and starting up a similar business. The traceability and proof of identity benefits of Director ID are expected to assist in mitigating serious financial crimes such as money laundering, fraud, and other illegal activities. Thanks, James. This particular item is really something that highlights how illegal activity is perpetrated in the current environment. The Australian Securities and Investments Commission recently completed a prosecution where a builder had lodged 43 false forms with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission between 2015 and 2018. Many of the officers that this particular individual had appointed as directors of companies did not know or did not provide their consent to their appointment. Their details had been fraudulently provided by this particular individual to the regulator. The crime and the lodgement of those forms over many years certainly could have been prevented if director identification had been introduced earlier. This particular case highlights the importance of how director identification will help combat this type of illegal activity in future. Thanks, James. So let's talk about how to apply for a director ID. The fastest way, the quickest way to apply for a director ID is using the online service available through the abrs.gov.au website. We have a how to apply for your director ID video available from the ABRS website, abrs.gov.au, and it provides a step-by-step guide to help you navigate your way through the application service itself. It does require the use of a smartphone, and it will require production of some identification documents in order for you to prove your identity. It is, again, it's free to apply for your director ID, and you only need to apply once. There are non-digital channels available for those who don't have a smart device, those who are unable to use or have access to the internet, and those who just prefer to lodge in paper or over the phone. There are those avenues available for those individuals who need that service. There is a telephone service that's available to assist those in applying for their Director ID, 13 6250. As you can appreciate, right now, and as we approach the 30th of November deadline, our phone services are under extreme demand at the moment. So there may be extended wait times as we approach that 30 November deadline. But please, we'd certainly encourage you, don't wait for the 30th of November to apply for your Director ID. It's important that you apply now if you need to. There's plenty of information available on the abrs.gov.au website, and many of the resources that we're referencing this morning are available through that website. Thanks, James. I'll quickly step through the how to apply process. As I mentioned, using your smart device, you'll need to firstly set up a MyGov ID. MyGov ID is different to MyGov. Many of you may well be familiar with the MyGov service, especially here in Victoria. Many of us here in Victoria have our vaccination certificates stored in our MyGov service. MyGov ID is a different service. It is an identity verification service which gives you access to a number of different government services through a specific identity credential. To successfully get a MyGov ID, you need to have a driver's license or a learner's permit, a passport, a birth certificate, a visa, citizenship certificate, an IMI card or a Medicare card. These are documents that help prove your identity and help prove who you are. Importantly, it's up to the individual to apply for their own Director ID. This is not something that an agent, an intermediary, or someone else can do on behalf of a director. Directors themselves must apply because it is about proving their identity to the registrar. There are a couple of different identity strengths that can be applied for through the MyGov ID service. Those who are using a passport, for example, can qualify for a strong identity credential. Those who get that strong identity credential will skip the majority of step 2, which is about answering questions that the Australian Taxation Office knows about the individuals. This is called a proof of record ownership step, where the answers to the questions that the applicants provide help the Australian Taxation Office tie that individual to a tax record. Some of that information might be about their last notice of assessment, the bank account details where their last refund went to, perhaps a dividend statement, or a Centrelink payment summary, or a pay-as-you-go payment summary. You can, of course, use your tax file number. That is optional, but you'll also need to confirm the residential address known by the Australian Taxation Office. Once those steps are completed, the Director ID application itself is the third step, and it is just about confirming some of the pre-filled information that has come across from the MyGov service: your name, your name and date of birth, your email address, and some of the ATO information like your address. You may need to enter and update some of those records, like your place of birth and your mobile phone number, etc. But then you just complete a declaration, and once the submission is made, you will be issued with your Director Identification number instantly. There is no waiting period. There are no human interventions. The Director Identification number will come up on screen through that online service instantly. Thanks, James. I referenced a few moments ago the non-digital channels that are available for those who cannot use the online service or don't have access to the internet or a smart device. For Australian residents, we strongly encourage them to call 136250 to apply for their Director ID over the phone. Where we can, our operators will assist you in getting that Director ID over the phone rather than sending you out a paper form. There will be instances where we are unable to formally provide that identification over the phone, and there will be instances where we may need to send out a paper form. But in general terms, our operators will, again, using the documentation that the individual has about themselves, things like their tax file number, residential address, being able to answer 2 questions about information that the Australian Taxation Office knows about them, and the identity documents. In all probability, our operators will be able to issue that individual with their Director ID over the phone. The abrs.gov.au website has a full list of the types of identity information that are required in order to apply for the Director ID through the various channels, whether that be online, whether that be over the phone, or whether that be through paper. Thanks, James. Now, for those applying in paper, there are some very specific requirements, and clearly it will take a little bit more time in order to not only apply, but receive your Director ID. The requirements for paper, very much similar to the online and phone service, where you need a combination of primary and secondary identification documents like a birth certificate, passport, citizenship certificate, Medicare card, etc. But as you can imagine, it is a bit onerous because the applicants are required to provide certified copies of that information along with their application to the ABRS by post before we can assess and then issue a Director ID. There is also, for those, especially our First Nations people, who may not have access to a birth certificate, they may not have a passport or a driver's license, we do have a proof of identity reference form that can be completed by those individuals in those circumstances. Thanks, James. Next slide. So some of you may well be familiar with the referee form. It is a form or a process that is followed for the issuing of tax file numbers for our First Nations people who don't have access to or don't have a birth certificate, a passport, or any other form of identification. The referee form needs to be completed by an authorised referee. We have a detailed list of who the authorised referees are on the abrs.gov.au website. That list is reproduced here. Could be a council chairperson, community manager, school principal, minister of religion, doctor, or any of the other individuals that are listed here. The referee can't be a family member or any other person where it could create a real or perceived conflict of interest. And it can't be a person connected with matters where they have an actual or perceived personal or financial interest. It needs to be an independent third party providing the referee. Next slide, please, James. So what happens when you receive your Director Identification number? Well, firstly, you can save a copy of the electronic version of the Director Identification to your own computer by saving a PDF copy of it. It is available through the abrs.gov.au online account that you would have created, and it should be shared with the company secretary or the person who is looking after the records of the company, whether that be an ASIC registered company or an ORIC registered company. The Director Identification number can be shared with them because it will be used in future. The Director Identification number is a little bit different to a tax file number, whereas it doesn't need to be treated in the same manner. but it is still something that needs to be treated safely and securely. The director identification number in future will be used to link individuals to the companies to which they are a director of when the companies register, the ASIC companies register, moves across to the ABRS sometime in the future. At the moment, the director identification number is not something that is available to the public at this time. The registrar is yet to decide what director ID information will be made publicly available and when the company's register will be transferred across to the Australian Business Registry Services. There will be some ongoing consultation that the registrar will undertake shortly to identify exactly what information will be made available. Thanks, James. So I'll just cover off a little bit about what we're doing to reach directors with the director identification number message. So clearly, we're obviously engaged in a number of different forums, webinars, presentations and things, but there is very much an awareness campaign that has been underway since the 19th of October. The Assistant Treasurer, Stephen Jones MP, made a formal announcement of the commencement of the marketing campaign, which really aims to reach the individuals who are directors of companies. As I said earlier, one of the biggest challenges that we have is that many individuals don't understand that they are directors of companies because they may be, especially those who are involved in a self-managed superannuation fund, their wealth creation specialist, their financial planner, their accountant may well have set them up in that particular structure, and the individuals may not understand what that structure actually entails or whether it involves a corporate trustee, for example. Thanks, James. So in October, we've commenced a wide-ranging director ID marketing campaign. Some of you may well have seen some of this type of advertising in your local supermarket or shopping centre. If any of you have been to an airport lately, the electronic advertising carries some of these images. There is quite a bit of press about director ID at the moment, both online and in print. There is also a wide-ranging social media campaign aimed at reaching those particular directors with some of this imagery and the key messages around why directors need to apply for a director identification number. Thanks, James. So what happens if directors don't apply for their director ID or don't apply on time? There are significant penalties that are applicable for those who don't apply for a director ID. They range from monetary fines, $13,200 for individuals who don't apply for their director ID, right up to $1.1 million for other offences, and in some cases, imprisonment. Now, the ABRS is really looking to encourage directors to apply for their director ID. Our focus is really about educating, promoting, and creating that level of awareness across directors so that they are encouraged to apply for their director ID. And the ABRS wants to help those directors who want to do the right thing. The ABRS may well take firmer compliance actions should directors ignore that encouragement or where we are detecting potential illegal activity as a result of the director ID regime and compliance activities. Directors who don't meet their obligation may be referred to the appropriate regulator. That might be ASIC or ORIC, who will be responsible for enforcing director ID offences. The penalties that are applicable under both the Corporations Act and the CATSI Act, information about those penalties is available from the asic.gov.au website or the ORIC website as well. Thanks, James. So before we open this up for questions, a couple of key things to cover off. A director ID is a unique identifier given to a person who has verified their identity with the registrar. Directors themselves, a person needs to apply for their own director ID. This can't be done by your accountant. It can't be done by your company secretary. It can't be done by a friend or a other family member. It needs to be done by the director themselves. All directors of ORIC registered companies appointed on or before the 31st of October 2022 must apply by November 2023. New directors of ORIC entities must apply for their director ID prior to their appointment, and that was in place since the 1st of November. Directors of ASIC registered companies need to apply for their director ID by the 30th of November 2022. We're more than happy to make the presentation available through the Kinaway TV website, and for those who are tuned into this webinar, there are information resources and links that are available within the presentation, along with the ABRS contact number 136250. Thanks, James. I think we can take some questions if there are any.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, like you mentioned before, there have been a few posts there with a few sort of resources made available that were available in the presentation, available through the chat. Again, thanks for the presentation. We had a number of sort of questions that we did receive throughout, so we might spend the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes answering a couple of those if they weren't answered in the presentation. So we have one here from Luke, and Luke asks, what if I stop being a director before 30th of November?
Yeah, so the ABRS, so under the law, all eligible officers need to apply for a director ID. And as the law is currently written, those directors who are resigning within the transition period need to apply for a director ID. However, the ABRS has recently released draft legislative instruments to effectively exempt those directors from the obligation to apply for their director ID. It is certainly not expected that those directors who are resigning within the transition period will need to apply in future.
Sure. Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Luke. Our next question is from Isaac, and Isaac asks, how long does it take to receive your ID?
Yeah, so if you're applying, Isaac, online, you will get your director ID instantly. If you are applying over the phone, our operators, if they're able to suitably identify you and verify your identity, they will give you your director ID over the phone. If you are applying in paper, clearly that will take a little bit longer. The current service level and the application form stipulates that we aim to provide your director identification number within 56 business days of receiving your application. Now, the important thing for directors to remember is that the obligation is for them to apply by the 30th of November 2022. They don't necessarily need to receive their number by the 30th of November 2022. The obligation is for them to apply. So get your application in now.
Sure. Thanks, Isaac. This one's from Danny, but I think you've pretty much touched on it there. And Danny says, thanks for this. Kinaway and Robin, what if I need to submit a paper form but don't get my ID before 30th November?
It's fine, Danny. As long as the ABRS has received your application, you have effectively complied with that obligation. We may contact you subsequent to receiving your paper application if there is further information that's required. So for instance, Danny, if the driver's license or the passport or other information that you've provided hasn't been certified correctly, or the application hasn't been completed, we may contact you subsequent to that application. But as long as the application is in by the 30th of November, you've satisfied the requirement.
Wonderful. Thanks, Danny. And this is our final question we received this morning, Rob, and it's from Jackson. And Jackson asks, what if a director has passed away since the legislation came into effect?
Indeed. For those who may have unfortunately passed in the transition period, clearly they cannot apply for a director ID, and the ABRS would not issue a director ID to someone who we know has passed away. So they will not be required to apply for a director identification number.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jackson. So that's it for the questions we received for this morning. So yeah, Rob, just on behalf of Kinaway and our members, we want to thank you for joining us today, particularly such an important topic, and yeah, with the deadline fast approaching.
Thanks so much, James. Really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope the information that I've been able to share with you this morning has been beneficial.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, once again, thanks for everyone for tuning in today. Thanks again to Robin, and I should give a thanks to Tiernan as well, who we worked closely with in putting together this morning's webinar. For everyone who tuned in, don't forget to like today's video, hit the subscribe button and the notifications for any upcoming Kinaway webinars. We hope you enjoyed today, and we hope you enjoy your weekend. So once again, on behalf of Kinaway, we want to thank Robin and everyone who tuned in today.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.